Joining me on the line, the director of the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy and a man with an understanding of the Israeli position, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mark.
Just forgive me if I've pronounced your name wrongly, Jonathan. Can you find common ground with Paul Murphy today? He's saying that there's a sense among the ordinary people of Gaza that they want to be free from the whole blooming lot, the Israelis, Hamas and everybody.
Well, absolutely. I mean, those of us who observe this area and do so professionally, we see absolutely that the Palestinian people are very badly served by their leadership, and that really is the problem that entrenches this conflict that seems to drag on interminably.
So where do you see this going? He's saying, Paul's saying in studio that the people might go somewhere different, a la Egypt, the way other countries are. Do you see, would you be as ambitious maybe that the people will find, can I call it a third way in Gaza?
Well, we've got to look at what actually happens, I suppose, in order to predict things and to see where the trends are indicated. Unfortunately, what we see from the Palestinians, from all their leadership, whether it be Fatah, which is the so-called moderate wing, or Hamas, the terrorist wing, as recognised by the EU, by the US, or most other Western countries and bodies, whichever one it is, we don't see a very promising set of indicators for any kind of negotiated peace coming anytime soon, which of course must be depressing to the Palestinian people, who deserve better leadership than that. For example, I can just mention really the move for unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state at the UN under Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. As I said, the so-called moderates in this game. That in itself goes against previous agreements made with Israel, the Oslo Accords, and considerations such as that, which say that they shouldn't be taking unilateral steps to try to achieve statehood without negotiating with Israel.
Okay, I do want to bring Paul in a wee second, but Jonathan, I mean, surely this suits Israel just fine. A divided Gaza, divided Palestinian movement, essentially. I mean, that suits Israel just fine, doesn't it?
Well, I think that many Israelis would probably argue with that. It doesn't suit Israel just fine to have had over 1,500 rockets launched from Gaza at Israeli civilian population, and it certainly doesn't suit Israel to have an army made up of conscripts aged 18. Every Israeli child has to go into an army. So I think in a serious appraisal of the situation, it would be hard to say that either regular Palestinians or regular Israelis are happy with this situation.
You see, I mean, our debate can become very tired very simply here. For example, Paul, will you be talking about those rocket attacks? Very often the West will say, but they're attacking Israel. Will you refer to those rocket attacks today?
Certainly, I'm opposed to the rocket attacks, but any attempt to equate the rocket attacks with the ongoing nightly bombardment that exists of Gaza, with so-called Operation Cast Lead, which killed over 2,000 people, with the massive systemic oppression by the Israeli establishment of the Palestinian people, is wrong in my opinion. And I have massive criticisms of Hamas and Fatah, absolutely, and I think an alternative leadership needs to be built by the Palestinians, but the responsibility here for the absence of a peace and so on lies primarily with the Israeli establishment, and there will be no negotiated settlement until the right-wing establishment in Israel is overthrown. But I think it's a job for the Palestinian masses. But also, I think that the ordinary Israelis, workers and poor, are completely badly served by the current leadership they have, and opposed. Just the final point is about the idea that the Palestinians going to the UN for looking for recognition is a unilateral act. And when we're talking about Israel here, which nightly makes unilateral acts of bombardment, the act of going to a multilateral organisation like the UN and seeking recognition, it's incredible and just an offence of the Israeli establishment.
What acts of bombardment are you referring to nightly?
Most nights in Gaza you have air bombardment by the Israeli Defence Forces.
Jonathan?
Well, I think it's interesting to hear Mr. Murphy speaking there, because the problem with this conflict is people who have entrenched views not being willing to look at actually what's happening and to try and find a sensible and rational explanation and way ahead. And I think he's an embodiment of that. Looking at Operation Cast Lead, looking at Israeli action in Gaza. Operation Cast Lead, if you analyse the situation and the cold hard facts, it was a reaction to years of bombardment from Gaza, of rockets and mortars onto the Israeli population. Now, the Israeli government, be it left wing or right wing, and at the time it wasn't a right wing government, they're perfectly clear when they explain why they do those things. What they say is that they need to protect their civilians, the civilian population of Israel that lives in the south within range from Gaza, and that's a range which is increasing with the import of Iranian weapons through ships such as the Corrine A, which preceded these flotillas that Mr. Murphy himself has taken part of. It's really a stunt to call these a humanitarian mission when, in fact, there's plenty of scope for humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, as it always does, and as it could have done in the example of the flotillas. It could have gone to the ports in Egypt or in Ashdod, and instead it was an aggressive act designed to provoke a reaction from Israel, protecting its civilian population.
Paul, it's a point that I actually put the other guys in the flotilla. You know, I mean, obviously, flotilla, Western guys, politicians going into Gaza. It's not, in a sense, an aid flotilla is one thing of calling it. I mean, clearly there's politics in that. Clearly you're trying to put one up the Israelis there. Clearly that will inflame.
It's a political act, absolutely. It's a humanitarian and a political act, but to call it a provocation is just incredible. When you have, I mean, a peaceful ship, I don't think anyone is claiming that we're carrying weapons or we're prepared to fight or anything like that. A peaceful ship.
That's not true. Everyone saw the videos of people on that ship bludgeoning the Israelis who boarded it in order to stop it breaking an internationally recognised blockade area, according to the San Remo manual.
Hold on a second, fellas. Both, I was really enjoying this because I'm hearing two perspectives here, which I have struck me to this point is very rational. Let's not go for the old tennis thing at all. By the way, just let me add to the debate. The Israeli Justice Ministry, I understand, has reached a deal to free the Palestinian hunger striker Qadar Adnan. He's been on hunger strike for 2 months and he has agreed to resume eating. He's to be freed on April the 17th. Paul Murphy, Jonathan are calling for people maybe of your perspective or maybe of the pro-Palestinian perspective to be sensible and rational. I wonder how it would feel to you as a proud Irishman to be surrounded by nations who fundamentally denied your right to exist as an Irish nation, as an Irish citizen. Israelis would say that's their lot in life.
See, I don't deny the right of an Israeli state to exist. I'm opposed to the Israeli establishment. And I think my viewpoint is perfectly rational. It isn't formed just from speaking to one side, etc. I have co-thinkers in Israel who are opposed to the policies of the Israeli government in terms of the oppression of the Palestinians and also the domestic policies. And I think that, there is going to be no solution found on the basis of the continuation of Israeli oppression of the Palestinians. That's the question here that needs to be ended at, and it's the source of the problem.
Paul, thank you for joining us today. Jonathan, just finally, little things like that can oil a process, can't they? The hunger striker Qadar Adnan is eating again. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian question seems to have gone to sleep while the world observes an incredible Arab Spring. Might we see talks resumed finally, Jonathan Sacerdoti?
Well, I think the so-called Arab Spring has absolutely awoken in the consciousness of the West the fact that they've concentrated so obsessively on this region of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza at the expense of understanding the rest of the wider Middle East. And of course, the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy, we deal in all of these areas, not just Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I would say that it's very important that Israel stop being blamed for all of the problems in the Middle East. As can be seen, the nations surrounding it all have their own social problems and political problems, which are in many ways dwarf anything that's going on in Israel.
Jonathan, thank you for joining me. Jonathan Sacerdoti, they're the director of the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy.